Welcome to Memphis Machine,
a Muddy Pig production.
I'm Jonathan Bass.
and I'm Carl Casperson, and together we're looking to show off the creative sights and sounds of Memphis, Tennessee.
Amen.
This episode with Paul Taylor is brought to you by Snakebite Company, makers of the original Snakebite bottle opener and Mamba bartending tool. They are 100% made in the USA. Snakebite loves making products and apparel for the happy hours, the after hours, and the weekend hours. When it's your time to relax and be yourself, check them out at Snakebite Co. That's snakebiteco.com, and on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at SnakebiteCO. Get inspired with Redwire. They are experts in audio and visual design and installation in the Mid-South and beyond. Redwire Audio Video specializes in the design, installation, rental, and support of high-quality and affordable custom audio, visual, video, lighting, broadcast, and control systems for worship facilities and large public venues. You can reach them at www.redwireav.com. And of course,
Get yourself a soul burger.
get yourself right now. Get
At
yourself
Ernestine
a soul
and Hazel's.
at Ernestine and Hazel's.
No secret by now that this is one of our favorite places in Memphis.
They say it's haunted. I haven't seen a ghost, is what I'm trying to say.
I haven't seen one.
No, but everyone else, plenty of people have seen lots of weird things there. And here's the history. Go upstairs, see where all the weird stuff went down. See Nate's Bar, where we tracked this particular, no, not Paul's, but we tracked most of our, well, you'll hear us.
Yeah, you'll hear it. The place has got a lot of vibe,
It's got a lot of vibe.
and they're really super nice to us.
Speaking of vibe and super nice, Paul Taylor agreed to sit down with us. And Paul, we picked Paul because he is one of those working guys.
Who is
Working
synonymous
musicians.
with Memphis.
Yes,
music.
and he's just as we call out in the episode, he's not just a triple threat. He's a quadrupled, quadruped. Coffee hasn't kicked in yet, but Paul is equally gifted songwriter, drummer, bassist, and guitarist. And I've gotten
Producer.
to play and producer. I've gotten to play with Paul, with him hitting the skins, playing drums and guitar, and he's marvelous, very gifted, delightful musician, and has some things, some thoughts on Memphis. And check it out.
It should also be mentioned that we recorded this episode at Crosstown Concourse,
Yes.
and we will get into that in this episode.
Crosstown Concourse. Crosstown is a endeavor of revitalizing the Sears distribution building that was vacant and maybe haunted.
And the Crosstown Arts Studio, where this was recorded.
And they have these amazing internships where musicians and artists of all different mediums are being sponsored by Crosstowns to develop their gift and further infect Memphis with beauty and goodness.
It's a fantastic program, and we hope you enjoy this interview.
Ready, Mr. Bass?
Smoke 'em if you got 'em.
God bless Post. Ready.
Y'all can edit like dumb stuff, right?
We keep all the dumb stuff as blackmail.
Cool.
We might not air it, but we keep it.
Well, welcome to another episode of Memphis Machine. We have what I would call a triple threat. Yeah, who doesn't know how to use his iPhone? No, we have in the theater world, triple threats are regarded to people that can what, Jonathan?
I have no idea.
They can
not a theater
sing. Come on, they can sing, they can dance,
dance.
and they can act.
That's right.
It's called a triple threat. And Paul may play another 12 other instruments, but he is known primarily as a drummer, a bassist, and a guitarist. And I just want to bring that up at the top because, the qualification being that he works regularly on all three instruments, which I think is pretty cool. Anyway, but welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thanks.
How about that for an introduction?
Well, I'm happy to be here. I think of myself mostly as a songwriter.
And he's a quadrithreat,
Quadrithreat, yeah.
there,
Absolutely.
and a songwriter.
I do threaten people with listening to my songs sometimes, so it's true.
You without asking how old you are, I mean you're younger than 50 and you're older than 20.
I'm straight up 44. 4'4". It's a good drummer's age. Nice even.
But you've had, but since a young age, you've had your finger to the wind of Memphis music and Memphis trends and things that make Memphis, Memphis. And, typically with our guests, we've kind of tried to start from the beginning, a little biography. So
did you grow up in Memphis?
Why break
I
form?
did.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're a true Memphian?
The Midtown Memphian to the core.
Yes.
As much good fortune as I've had to travel around and stuff, basically have lived within about a mile of where we're sitting for almost my entire life.
That's awesome.
Yeah, with very few exceptions.
So you've seen a lot of trends come and go, so to speak?
Well, define trends.
I mean, as far as like, what is a Memphis sound? What is if people think of Memphis music?
Yeah,
you've been a part of a lot of Memphis music.
Sure. Well, I've had the good fortune to grow up around some people who were directly connected to the birth of rock and roll, and were on the scene in a really culturally important time that a lot of people do sort of define as the iconic Memphis sound time, which would be between the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, Memphis music has a storied history that dates further back to the early 20th century, but if you're talking about Sam Phillips kind of recording a lot of blues artists and searching for the white guy that could in sort of inventing rock and roll by sort of co-opting the music that was happening that he was there's so many reasons why all of the Memphis sound sort of happened that were for lack of a better word not the most positive social socioeconomic conditions that
Right.
were adverse for people who were not white males. And, when people talk about, like, we're going to get back to the Memphis sound and we're going to recreate it and there's going to be a big comeback. Well, do you want to bring back, like, segregation and, certain people's rights not having the right to vote and things like that? And, there was a lot of tension and really bad situations that created a lot of the, and that's true of art, arguably in almost any instance that out of very negative situations come, art.
I think the Machiavelli family back there, and did I say that right? Machiavelli?
Right.
Machiavelli.
The Machiavelli, my wife will correct me later. But the great patrons of the Renaissance, they weren't the nicest people to deal with if you got on their bad side. But boy, they were responsible for a lot of beautiful things.
Yeah, for sure.
But
so my take on that whole thing about the Memphis sound is that there's kind of an iconic period that created a lot of great music, and it's great to respect it and study it and to, sometimes play it out live and stuff, but I've never been a fan of the whole concept of like trying to sort of be a revisionist.
Or don't let nostalgia rule the form.
That's probably a better way to put it. Having said that, I don't know how many countless hours, even this past year, I've spent like learning Teenie Hodges and Steve Cropper guitar parts, or studying Al Jackson and Howard Grimes and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's critically important towards moving forward to acknowledge the past and to study the masters. But it's just like, you gotta, for me personally at least, and this may not be true for other people, but I like to assimilate that stuff and then kind of forget about it and just still sort of do my own thing,
Okay, well, tell us. So your dad, delivered you. Your mom and dad delivered you into this era, to where you're now working musician. But how did Memphis inform your dad, thus informing you, thus here you are?
Yeah, it is a bit of it could be a long-winded and complicated story, but so my dad was a product of. He was born in 1949, and in the mid 60s, he was like singing in like teenage like garage bands and rock and roll bands around here, and he was a rather strikingly handsome young man, and he had a great voice, and he was idolized by a lot of like teeny bopper, just the teenage crowd. He was wildly popular. He sang in a band called the Village Sound that became Edgewood, and primarily at first he was a vocalist in these bands, and then he sort of picked up guitar along the way. Learned some of his first guitar chords actually from Steve Cropper, coming down to a basement where they were all like great. Rehearsing and like showing them like, this is a G chord. My dad went to Messick. And so my mom had 4 sisters and 1 brother, but her eldest sister, my Aunt Jenny, who was known at the time as Mary Williams, and they were a family from Fraser, and she, my aunt, was just an amazing knockout woman in her own right. Not to just talk about people's looks or whatever, but she was just this like scenester like lady, and she wound up marrying a guy named, I'm not really sure how this exactly happened, but she wound up marrying a guy named Jerry Williams, who co-owned a studio with Steve Cropper called Trans Maximus.
Goodness.
And also she was a B-list staff songwriter for Stax. I have all these manuscripts she gave me that are like David Porter, Mary Williams,
Goodness.
Sir Mac Rice, Mary Williams. She was really close with Mac Rice. She was really good, friends with Priscilla Presley and Elvis. She hung out a lot at like both Gracelands and was part of like the scene of people who would go like to Liberty Land, after hours and like go to the movie theaters. Elvis would rent out the Memphian right over here at Overton Square. And, but all of this to say, my dad, Pat Taylor, came into a recording session at Trans Maximus, and because my aunt was married to one of the owners, my mom was a secretary there. Yeah. And my mom was one of the teeny bopper like fan club of my dad anyway, that like literally, the times were different back then. People were just kind of naive. If you look at pictures of Beatlemania and stuff, like they would like hide like around the corners and giggle at like the dudes that they followed around and stuff,
like they do with jazz musicians.
Right. It's just like we have it when we play our jazz shows. It's easy for you to comprehend. But so I think that was when they first started talking, because my mom was terribly shy, and all that to basically, is the way that I sort of rationalized saying, if it hadn't have been for Steve Cropper having a recording studio with this guy Jerry Williams, maybe my mom and dad may not have had the chance to meet, and I might not have been born. So
all thanks to Steve Cropper.
Right, and my whole life, I've mostly thought, most of my musical talent stuff comes from my dad because of his career as a musician. But the more in recent years that I've thought about it, I realized that very much like some of my most credible legitimate connection to like Memphis sound and history and stuff is from my aunt, who was a songwriter for Stax, and It was a late life revelation for me, or a recent life.
That's great.
Hopefully this isn't my late life.
So becoming, so you were just expected to pick up an instrument and go? Or pick up 3 or 4 in your case?
Well, my dad then became a guitar player, and he played in a bunch of bands. And my mom and dad divorced in the mid-'70s when I was a young kid. And so, but then he married another lady named Suzanne Jerome, and they formed a band called The Breaks. But also my dad did a lot of jingle work and session work. He was in studios a lot, and he subsequently became he was doing a session with John Hampton one day, the great famous producer and recording engineer, and Hampton was just like, man, I just wish I could just start over with, like, I wish I could teach somebody who didn't know anything from scratch what I know. And my dad was like, dude, I'll do that. That's literally how he became a recording engineer, and he wound up having a long career as a recording engineer as well. But all that to say that, the room we're sitting in right now at my Crosstown Arts music residency is sort of a glorified home recording studio. And this room's not unlike a room that is I've always lived in a house that sort of had a room with drums, bass, and guitars and recording gear.
Right.
I mean, back then it was like, Tascam and Fostex 4-tracks and stuff like that. But when I was, 5 and 6 years old in the early 80s, my dad was literally helping me 4-track songs where I was playing chords on a Casio and singing about this girl, Ginger, who I had a crush on in the first grade.
Ginger.
Second grade. And I have tapes and tapes of songs I was writing. And because the gear was around, the more I learned how to run it, and he would let me, if I was good, he'd let me use the gear. And I wound up really teaching myself sort of my own system of music at the time before I actually learned what was going on, by sequencing and recording music and just sort of figuring out all the parts. And I was a lover of the Beatles and a lot of song-oriented bands. My dad, one thing that is interesting, somehow he never really instilled in me much love of other kind of music or besides rock and roll or just what he was into. And his scope wasn't super deep, honestly. He wasn't really into jazz or classical music or anything outside of just the popular music that he'd grown up listening to.
Right.
And it wasn't until a bit later that I started discovering other kinds of music. But yeah, I mean, the way that I started playing music was kind of by accident. I wound up with a full-size kit of Gretsch drums when I was 3 years old. And there are tapes of me playing at Ardent. The recording engineer, Ron Capone, is you can hear him on the talk bike going play a beat, Paul. He was a real New York guy. And I'm literally going my foot wouldn't reach, but you can hear that I'm keeping steady eighth notes on the hi-hat and a steady 2 and 4 and just sort of had a natural proclivity towards good timekeeping.
That's great.
I just feel like I was environmentally conditioned.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of that is that because there was the wow factor that I could do that at a really young age, and all my dad's friends were like, Paul, you're so great. You're going to be such a badass when you grow up. And that's kind of what I thought was going to happen. And it's also what my dad and my mom thought was going to happen. And it really wasn't until a little bit later, in my early teens, that I started realizing I didn't understand the musical language in terms of music notation and just music theory and things. And then I had to start really working. And if you have a natural talent and you've sort of built your own system, then you kind of have to work double hard to sort of rearrange your brain patterns and come to understand the common actual musical language.
Right.
And but I wound up playing bassoon in 7th grade briefly, and then I sort of transitioned to electric bass. And I became a bass player professionally when I was age 14 by accident, because one of my mom's friends, who was, I think in his late 20s, asked, or I just heard him saying to her he was looking for a bass player, and I was like, I'll do it. And he was like, but they wound up actually letting me play bass with them, and I never had intended to be a bass player, but I was a huge fan already of the fretless bass. We had lived in England when I was 10, and I'd been really drawn to Pino Palladino's fretless bass.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know anything about Jaco yet. This would be a few more years before I'd become a Jaco nerd, for better or for worse. But, yeah, it was I wound up having a long career as an electric bassist in town and sort of a music nerd thing happening. And it was just a total accident, random, just accepting a gig with this guy.
That's great. Yeah.
That led me to gigging.
Do you remember maybe what that first, I don't know, you said you were just kind of in the rock and roll thing, and you remember any occasion where something pulled you away from rock and roll and into other things, classical, jazz, otherwise?
A few things. I played in jazz band in high school, and my concept of what jazz was about as far off the mark as it possibly could be. I thought it was like old white dudes in suspenders, before that. But my great teacher, Bill McKee, had us listening to Charlie Parker, and I think it kind of dawned on me that wow, there's this more deep, really incredible thing. And I had really somewhat shamefully, but also serendipitously, I had read this obituary of this bass player in Guitar Player magazine in 1987, and it was this dude named Jaco Pastorius, and they mentioned that he had played with Joni Mitchell. And I'd grown up listening to Joni Mitchell. Blue is one of my parents' favorite records, and it was a record I've grown up with, still to this day one of my absolute favorite records. But they had mentioned that he played with her, and I was like, oh, I think I've seen some of these records they're talking about in my parents' record collection. And I went, after I read this obituary, and rummaged through, and sure enough, there was Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. And I put it on, and just the sound of that fretless bass is so lyrical, and it was just so revelatory. It completely changed my life, at that moment. And I was I want to say I was 15 years old, 14. So, yes, 13 or 14 maybe.
Right.
And that really kind of led me to discovering Weather Report and, getting into fusion and all this stuff that is really, I don't know if it was the best direction, and I can't regret, you can't look back and have regrets in life, but I maybe wish that I'd heard more it would be a couple more years until I'd really discover Charles Mingus and Thelonious Monk and all the standard jazz people that are great, If that answers your question at all. It's all kind of a long-winded circle of why I'm the weirdo that I am,
I mean, that thread of bass playing is, boy, I mean, it's addictive as a bass player for sure. I mean, because you're just holy cow, the possibilities, and the chops that you can gain from that regimen. But then also, being able just to play a pocket quote kind of gig as well.
Well, my first bass playing in the band with the guy, I was in a band called Hoi Polloi, and his name was David Wyndham, and it was Bruce Thomas, Colin Moulding style bass, British pop style, really melodic, or Paul McCartney, obviously, melodic bass playing. That's stuff I was really drawn to, and I was already really into that, and also because I was a skateboarder right in the heart of the classic era of the mid and late 80s, and so I was, I played in some straight edge punk bands, hardcore, and but one of my biggest heroes was a guy named Mike Watt, who was in a band called Minutemen, and then Firehose, and he's super melodic, amazing bass player, who I still to this day just absolutely worship, and that had a huge influence on me. But then when I heard Jaco, actually, the next year, the first thing I heard of his was the super melodic stuff, and it was just took my breath away because it was so lyrical, and it wasn't very choppy.
Right.
But then I think I mentioned it to my dad's drummer, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I've got his solo record on vinyl. I'm going to let you borrow it." And then when I heard all that stuff, him playing Donna Lee, and it's just that stuff. As a kid, that's when the sort of jock athletic nature kicks in, and you're like, that's badass. I want to learn how to do all that flashy stuff, and that can be it can be positive because it can help you aspire to build up your technique, but it can be negative because technique should be the ends and the means sort of being which one, I don't know.
I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but at the same time, I don't mind. But I've told people this before, why I like jazz, if they've asked me, and I think if you look at a pendulum between let's say punk music on one side of the pendulum, and it swings back to a very heady, straight ahead jazz, and I know you're a fan of Ornette and even some of the more outside, rambunctious authors of jazz. I think it's the same kind of emotional current that's informing both swings of the pendulum. I don't know if you guys would agree with that or not, but like,
well, in its essence,
because in a punk music you have this, either rage. It's a highly intensive, emotive situation, and I would say I experienced that same thing like in a jazz situation, where just everyone's just kind of, and it could be, for a really lame term, but you could have like methamphetamine on one side and a pharmaceutical grade Adderall on the other, but it's still speed. You're still just going,
Totally. It's just different, languages of the same emotion. I mean, it's like cursing in French or in English, or singing a love song in French or in English. It's the same. You're just trying to say the same things. They're just coming out in a different code,
right,
if you will.
But for people that would say, "Oh, jazz is so nerdy, it's so cerebral," I'm thinking, well, yeah, but it's also super highly emotive.
Well, of course. I mean, at its root, jazz being African American art form, and arguably one of the greatest things that America has to offer the world ever. But it definitely came, it's an African American tradition that, as a white musician, I feel it's important to acknowledge that, because to some degree we've co-opted culturally that. But then you get into like, is co-opting bad? And it's just a fact of life. That's going to happen in all sorts of ways. I mean, do we co-opt the behavior of our parents or whatever? How, to what degree do you want to take that kind of thing? But I think as long as you're coming from an honest place, and also to realize that all these years later now it means something entirely different. But in its root form, it also is related to blues, and there were, again, the same like socioeconomic conditions and adverse, horrible treatment of black folks that, I mean, for lack of a better word, created a very soulful thing in a lot of the best musicians, and it's not super clinical. I mean, you listen to Charlie Parker or Ornette, and there's like a love cry and an anguish cry. Or if you listen, I mean, I just feel like that's true of even, a lot of different people. I did want to get back to, not to seg in and out, but just to kind of finish the nerdy bass player segment of my life. One day, one of my dad's musician friends came over. He was an electric bass player who had studied with Tim Goodwin, and he showed me in one sitting the Head to Ornithology, How High the Moon, and Teen Town, all on the bass. And I learned all of them in the matter of like an hour and a half, just as a mimic, not understanding the theory, but certainly learning how to, I learned really fast how to play them, and I was just really into it. And then another musician friend of my dad's who played in a lot of bands with him was the great, brilliant local Memphis musician mind, Sam Shoup.
Oh, yeah.
And he was so impressed, I guess, with my playing and my enthusiasm towards music that he gave me his 1968 Fender jazz bass, fretless.
Nice.
And so that was like 15 years old, I think. And so I really learned most of my formative years of actually learning like how to play music was on this fretless bass. And I owe all of those guys like a tremendous debt of gratitude for their kindness and just like their belief in me. And I didn't wind up becoming an extremely well-studied jazz musician by any stretch of the means. I'm way too all over the place with my multi-instrumentalism and all that stuff to be like, I just don't have the time to dedicate to any one. One of my teachers and friends as a drummer actually is Alvin Fielder, the great jazz drummer. But he was like, Paul, you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. And it hurt me really bad when he said that. I was in my early 20s, but it's always stuck with me, and I had to realize that it's true. And, I'm just going to make the weird original left of center music that I make. I have to kind of be at peace with the fact that I'm not going to be like a super high level bebop musician, No. But I'm still super grateful to those jazz guys for teaching me all that stuff.
Yeah, although, I mean, both Jonathan and myself had played with you, and you hang as well as
well, I can fake it as a drummer better than I can. Better than I could. Like I couldn't, I do study and deeply love jazz as a guitarist, and I've definitely tried to spend some time with it. But, you know, I think to really do that at a high level, you need to just do that and do that every day. And, you know, talking about like high level, you know,
Right.
cool jazz, post bop, like language stuff. Man, that's just something that I don't know that I have enough time
I think you're
on
right,
earth
though.
to do that and do the other stuff I want to do.
But the question is, it's exactly right. I mean, do you just want to do that?
Right.
Right. I mean,
And we know in this business there are guys who play very minimalistic, who just play at barely level, who have homes in Malibu and right. So you know the quirky side of this, but I would say a qualification for sure as to your abilities on all instruments. You regularly get called to gig on all three instruments.
I do.
You do,
but
Memphis is not a weenie music town. You got to be able to play.
Yeah, well, and I'm really non-denominationally speaking blessed to have been environmentally conditioned to like grow up in a house full of it. I mean, in a room much like, I mean, it's why I can, at a relatively credible level, play all three of those instruments.
And maybe speak to our upcoming musicians who might be listening to this, the importance that you know how each instrument is supposed to function.
Right.
Talk about that.
That is the truth, and I think that especially as a drummer.
I mean, we talked about Jocko. We talk about
So let's talk about the drumming thing, man. Like the best drummers, the best jazz drummers, the most technical jazz drummers, the most technically brilliant, who execute it in a way that is the most fun to listen to. Mm-hmm. All of them are like great writers and pianists and composers. Tony Williams, Joe Chambers, Max Roach. You know,
DeJohnette, I think, right?
DeJohnette, of course.
Peter Erskine.
Peter Erskine. There you go. Yeah, I mean, the list could probably go on and on. My mind always thinks of the great drummer Joe Chambers, just because I'm a huge fan of his, and like the songs that he wrote that are, or compositions rather, I guess you would call them, that were on like Bobby Hutcherson records that are just such amazing tunes. They're so well written, and his playing is so fire on them, you know. And I think that if there's any reason that I would hope people call me to play music with them, is because, like, I'm just real sympathetic to what I'd want to hear on the other instrument. Mm-hmm. You know, if I'm playing bass with people, I try to come from the fact that first and foremost, in my mind, I'm a songwriter and a song thinker, and you know, I want to be sympathetic to what the songwriter or bass player or drummer would want to hear in any opposite situation that I'm in, or if I'm playing guitar. You know?
Can you talk about that, actually? You're approaching playing as a songwriter. Can you?
Well, you know, for one thing, I make a lot of music with people who are playing songs, and yet I have, you know, also had a lot of experience chopping out or whatever, and you don't want to chop out over somebody's lyrics. And that's also true of, you know, in a jazz setting, I think the best music, I mean, like, take for example, like the, like Keith Jarrett trio, like the Gary Peacock, Jack DeJohnette. I mean, it kind of sounds like they're all soloing at once, but somehow they're not stepping on each other. And I would venture to say if you asked any one of them, they would probably be like, it's because they're listening more than they're thinking about what they're playing. And so it's crucial to be in the mindset where you're not dominating the time or trying to drive the boat. I mean, as a drummer, you do have to drive the boat sometimes, especially if you feel people dragging or rushing or whatever. You may need to commandeer the time. Mm-hmm. But in general, you kind of hope that the vibe and the direction, harmonically, time-wise, and syncopation-wise, like, are all sort of happening between everybody, you know? And that, you know, just comes from people who write songs and think about it from that kind of more empathetic place. Empathy is the most important factor.
Good asset.
You know, I saw recently, of all people, but Carlos Santana, it was like some Eric Clapton Crossroads thing that was on the Music Channel or something. And I'm not a huge Eric Clapton fan or Carlos Santana. I mean, I am of like early stuff, like certainly his like Blues Breakers and Cream stuff. But I just happened to catch this one little clip where he was talking, Carlos Santana, in this interview, and he said that John Lee Hooker had said to him, like, just go out there and give them chills. And that really, like, summed up exactly the way that I think that I like to approach almost any instrument or solo that I'm taking these days. It's like, what can I do that's more, like, meaningful in a way that's going to hopefully raise the hair on somebody's arms? As opposed to, man, I've been practicing these groupings of 5 and this altered scale, and, you know, now's my time to execute that over this chord change. Like, that's not going to be as meaningful as, like, just the intent. It's almost like there's this, the electricity that drives you, you just kind of change the voltage for a minute.
Right.
And you can just send it. Prime example of somebody who does that is, my friend Eric Gales.
Yeah.
He does that. He could just take one note. But Derek Trucks is another great example, you know, of that vibe.
So speaking of Eric Gales, I mean, how long you been playing with Eric?
Eric and I met when we were, I was like 17. He was actually a drummer and vibraphonist at the Overton High School Jazz Band.
Wow.
And there was some like high school jazz band convention thing at Central High School where I went and met him there, you know.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention I did grow up playing with some other second generation musicians.
Please. Yeah.
Because that made me think when I met him, I was with my Central High School jazz band cohort, Steve Selvage, who I still make music with.
Yeah.
And the Sons of Mudboy, his dad, and these guys I played with, Luther and Cody Dickinson. Their dad was a very important producer from Memphis named Jim Dickinson, and he did a lot of stuff. You just really have to look him up to kind of find out. And there's some incredible videos on YouTube where he talks about his philosophies and concepts. I encourage anybody who's serious about music to watch those videos. But there's really not a song-informed decision that I make musically that didn't somehow come from some wisdom I learned from him.
Right.
He was just very wise. He had been around. He was directly, had a direct link to the early days of Memphis music. He was on the scene, he recorded a single at Sun, and then went on to form like this band called Mudboy and the Neutrons that was with Steve's dad, Sid Selvage, and Jimmy Crosswaite, who is the last man standing. All of their dads and my dad, have all passed away, but we all continue to make their dad's music and that musical tradition. They do way more than I do. I've kind of drifted off from it, but spiritually always be there, called Sons of Mudboy.
Yeah.
But it's super important part of my life always are the musical ethics and credos and just production advice that I got from him.
Right.
And just etiquette, like musical etiquette and studio etiquette and so much.
Mentorship.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what we all need, and people of my age group, are lucky because we got to have connections to people like him who were directly on the scene. And also as a drummer, I mean, I got to sub for Renardo Ward at King's Palace in the mid 90s, late 90s, playing with Charlie Wood, the great organist. But when Charlie wasn't there, it would be Honeymoon Garner would be the organ player. And I mean, Calvin Newborn was the guitar player on that gig. And I mean, like, I subbed for a month for Renardo when he went to play with the jazz faculty of U of M in Africa. And I would do a lot of subbing for him there. And that's really how I learned how to be a jazz drummer, or I learned to trust my sense of time.
Yeah.
Charlie Wood would play so ahead of the beat. Calvin Newborn, or just right on top of it rather, and Calvin would play all over it. And it was for, the first few times I ever did it, I really failed because I just didn't know how to trust that I was going to have to
Oh, man.
lay it down. you know. But like Honeymoon Garner, like needed a ride home like every single time that he did that gig. So I would take him home and he would regale me with stories of the days of old, you know.
Wow.
Or like played bass with Ann Peebles on a tour in the mid-'90s, and James Mitchell was one of the horn players, Willie Mitchell's brother, who really made all the horn arrangements and all the stories that he gave. But the point, all of that's a kind of long-winded way to get back to what I was starting to say about 60 seconds ago, which is that people of our generation are lucky to have direct connections to people who are really on the scene of those formative Memphis music years. And what is going to happen now is that it's going to be more distilled through the generations because there will be less direct connections. And it'll be important for dudes like me to hopefully remember what they said and accurately reproduce it. And that's kind of impossible because, man, my memory's not all that great. And it just kind of seeped into some weird, like, amorphous vibe. And, you know, that will be lost. But I guess there will be new lessons and there will be new music created and, you know.
I mean, how do you get that through YouTube?
Well, I know, but at the same time, man, for all of the amazing experiences that I had, I also, you know, was a dumb, lazy guy for most of my life. And really, I've learned more technical things from YouTube myself. You know, as a late 30s to where I am now as a 44-year-old, I've probably practiced harder now and have learned more in the past 5 years than ever in my life, you know. I still, if I will actually say that I want to know more about music now than I ever did in the past.
Yeah.
Strange, but true.
That's good.
One other thing to that point, though, about, you know, the older generation, and I guess which really ties into your very first question about, like, trends in Memphis is, you know, can't be too precious about it. And you can't hang on to the concept that there is this one iconic time. I mean, you have to pay respect to it, but also, I mean, it's all going to change, and
right.
You can't guard that. It's just more apparent now because we have, like, electricity and recorded I mean, the reason that all of this is happening at all is because our lives are coincident with this new invention, relatively new invention called electricity, and like music being recorded, and that created this culture where, like, you could sell these things called records, but really it's all like an artifice of the real thing. It's not like the way that music has always actually been for millennia, which is resonating tones in a room with people and with your friends and your brothers. And, you know, it's a Western culture like phenomena.
Yeah, you're preaching the truth. I hope that, well, I mean, my wife and I, the gospel of live performance is important. I think as people become more saturated, even more so with digital media and just on-demand everything, that people will start to crave and be lonesome for humans making stuff, especially, you know, either like live theater, live musicals or opera, and music too. Like, my goodness, there's human beings doing things not too far away from me, and because it's a different animal altogether.
It's a refreshing for people who stare at things that are created by ones and zeros all day long, you know. And also, I mean, you hear the same tones, the same algorithms without knowing it because it's all going through the same mastering gear and the same, like, DAWs and stuff like that. So, like, in some weird way, the dithering and the processing and the converting is all probably just the same stuff regurgitating what you think is sounding like different music, but it's probably exhausting all of us and just changing our brains in ways that we can't fathom.
And it's not the air that's moving
right
in the location where the music is being played.
It's true.
Yeah, and that's
I mean, go ahead.
No, go ahead. We can edit this.
No, just one last. Well, no, just to tag. When Jonathan and I first met, we discovered we both like Wayne Krantz. We're both Wayne Krantz.
Such a badass.
Oh my gosh,
such a weirdo.
It's just ridiculous.
Tell you what, and I got to go see him. I was in New York and I got to go down to Bar 55, and I got to see Anthony Jackson, Keith Carlock,
Oh my God.
and Wayne Krantz just duke it out. And I was at the bar, and I could have reached over and just wiped Mr. Krantz's nose for him, which wouldn't have been a bad idea. But just be. I mean, and anyone who enjoys live music, it was overwhelming. It was like a tsunami of just my brain being fried, just emotionally being just, all of it. And he makes, at the time, he had a couple DPA microphones, and he would make a stereo recording, and he would, you could go on his website, drop $5 and download the entire set.
Yeah.
And I remember being so excited I couldn't wait. And I got home from my trip, and I looked it up, like, oh man, my night's there, and I downloaded it, and I play it back, and I was like, well, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Like it was still great, but it was so underwhelming compared to being there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, man.
Well, I want to get back to the thought that, for one thing, like, my faith is huge. The younger generation, I mean, I've had the great fortune lately of making music with a lot of people who are literally half my age, and they're phenomenal musicians. And interestingly enough, a lot of them don't have the same influences, completely new set of influences, and
Right.
people who are alien to me, but they're still making beautiful music. It's just coming from a place that maybe you or I wouldn't expect it. And I think that's part of the change that, we as old people have to like sort of embrace.
Right. And so I was going to ask this earlier, and now we might not have to edit this back into the beginning.
No.
So talking about change and that very thing you just said, not holding on to stuff. Like, I think we asked this of Richard too, Cushing. I mean, you've been in Memphis for a long time, and what changes, like, we can just start at Midtown. If you want to. Like, what changes in the scene have you observed in your life, downtown?
It's funny, I've been saying this a lot lately, and I'm really happy to say it here. In a way that probably seemed curmudgeon, and also, as a personal note, I've just become a more at peace and happier person. There are a whole lot of other things that happened in my life that precipitated me being somewhat of a loner and not having a really easy time making music with people or being friends with people. I just did. It took a lot for me to get to where I am now as a human being, and I'm a late bloomer in terms of being at peace and being easy to be around at all. But I often have had the curmudgeon-y attitude that it made me really mad when people were like, Memphis music is coming back and blah, blah, and I was always like, man, that's silly and not true, and you just need to let the old stuff die or whatever. But I can say with 100% confidence that right now I've never seen such a just renaissance of great playing and scenes that are all just kicking ass and amazing musicians, so many great songwriters, so many great players. Everybody's cool with each other. People are putting out great records. There are a lot of recording studios that are like working here.
Yeah.
There are some that aren't functioning as well as they should, but I mean, things are happening in a very positive way here, and I am old enough to have seen that not happen here for a very long time. And I guess what I was trying to say is I'm not sure if that was because I was a curmudgeon and had my eyes closed to it, or if it's just really true that like right now finally things are truly coalescing in Memphis in a way that is very fertile for creation. And I'm super stoked to get to be a part of it. As an old man, I think you're kind of blessed if you get a little bit of, any sort of situation in your life that, to be able to kind of, it is one thing Jim Dickens said, it's just great to be able to burn along steadily for a long time than to just sort of flash and sort of fade out. But so it's been great to sort of hang around and get to see and make music with these people who are just absolutely inspiring now,
Such as current artists that you're digging.
Man, I hate to say this, but I don't want to name anybody at the risk of excluding somebody else. Because if I do, then I will forget other people. But I can tell you there are a lot of great artists that are well worth seeking out here.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. All right. I won't push
know.
you on that, but yeah, that's all right.
Saw that one coming.
But
Okay. As an art, not only are you a competent sideman, a sought after. Let's just, you're a sought after, competent sideman because you keep getting called back. Mostly. But you're also an artist. Back to the songwriting, and you have coming up. You're debuting an EP now. You've released music before.
Yeah, I have a few records
Right.
floating out there. Some of them I would rather not list because I'm, man.
Well,
They're 10 years old, and I'm not so happy.
Okay, but like you said, like with
I'm a better singer now.
the last 5 years have been very inspirational for you. You've been studying, you've been cranking. So
I'm
talk
about to release a ton of music.
Talk about the thing that's coming up.
Well, I imagine by the time this blog comes out, this will have already happened. But I'm releasing an EP called The Old Forest Loop.
Yes.
Let me go back for a second.
Please.
Y'all probably realize by now I can be quite long-winded and have to talk in circles.
No, it's great.
That's why we're doing a podcast.
Yeah, the computer loves it.
Radio.
It's all good.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in 2015, my dad passed after a long battle with cancer, and there was all this acoustic music. I would take my guitar and play by his bedside and just go hang out with him and play guitar. And I had all these little ditties that they were kind of peaceful, pretty guitar things. And when he passed, and I was spending a lot of time at a place I love a lot, the trails in Overton Park, walking my dog. Those trails are called the Old Forest Trail, and I realized, wow, I'm going to make this into like an EP. And so in the fall of 2015, I released only on Bandcamp an EP called The Old Forest Trail. It's mostly acoustic, like solo acoustic guitar stuff. And then the next year, in 2016, they changed the name of the Old Forest Trail in Overton Park to the Old Forest Loop. And they took all the beautiful old signage out and replaced it with these look like totem poles from the zoo, the Memphis Zoo, the way that their aesthetic is of these
Sure.
tan stones.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is gross, this is horrible. But then, so I was really pissed off for a while, but then I was like, well, what if, my initial thing is, what if I remixed all of the Old Forest Trail stuff into an electronic thing and called it the Old Forest Loop? But that wound up not really being practical, so I just wound up recording some kind of psychedelic, lo-fi, experimental, not electronic, but electric music as the follow-up to Old Forest Trail and called it the Old Forest Loop.
Nice.
And so I'm releasing that. It's coming out Friday the 13th of July, 2018.
Excellent.
It'll already be out by the time people hear this. If anybody makes it this far in this podcast, they'd hear that. But that's kind of, my songwriting, I have 2 records out on Apple, Spotify. The first one is called Open Closed. It's from 2007. And the follow-up to that was called Share It, 2009. And they're wildly eclectic records. Stylistically, they're all over the place. And especially back then, my voice was just not, I really don't think I'd found myself. Mm-hmm. I was trying to sing more affected, like Alex Chilton or British people I was into, like XTC or, whatever. And I was trying not to sound like my dad, who had a really wholesome and great singing voice, but I always thought was you just don't want to be like your dad,
Aww.
And the more that I've allowed myself to sing like who I really am, and it sounds like him, the more I've found a good singing voice. And, but all that to say, the Old Forest Loop is a kind of off-the-cuff instrumental. There's one song that's got lyrics on it, but they're obscured by a flanger. And it's a protest song. But it's a mostly instrumental EP that's just kind of off-the-cuff, lighthearted vamps. There's not a lot of overt melody, not a lot of overt chord progression. It's kind of more coming from the place of groove and just vibes. And it's a palate cleanser of my past and a warm-up to stuff I plan on releasing in the future. I'm going by a new band name called the New Memphis Colorways. Actually, but it's New Memphis Colorways.
Color Waves or Ways?
Color Ways, W-A-Y-S.
All right.
Color Ways.
Yeah.
But so it's just an introduction to a kind of new ethic for me of stuff that's maybe coming from a different place than my normal songwriting is. I'll still release records under Paul Snowflake Taylor as a songwriter, but the instrumental side will be I had a very weird leftronica, as I called it, project in the early 2000s called Interrobang, and it was
I love it.
It was like all kinds of, I was playing samplers and children's toys and CNCs and sequenced a bunch of music on the PlayStation 1, and just there was this huge rig I would bring out for live shows and talking to, mind you, this is before flat screen TVs or like really computer monitors were just easily available, so I'd bring like a tube TV out and just crazy stuff. But I am releasing also, so that's the first thing I'm releasing, and then this probably starting late summer, if not early fall, I'm going to release 3 more EPs, but they will be Paul Snowflake Taylor song. I recorded a record 2 years ago. I thought it was the best work I'd ever done, and I pitched it to all these local labels, and it got like flat out rejected by everybody. But again, it was because the music I write is just wildly all over the place. And it's interesting, man. I played it for a lot of young people, and they all love it. I think young kids these days really dig all kinds of stuff.
Yes.
And I hate to say this because it's no mark against my record label owning local buddies who I do a lot of session work for and stuff, but I think it was rather short-sighted and closed-minded of them to not understand that they didn't have to be able to pigeonhole or market a record as one thing. If they could just let me be my weird self, that probably would be cool in the eyes of a lot of people.
Yeah.
But that was not to be, and for a while I was really kind of upset about it, but then it also dawned on me, well, maybe I could compromise and sort of organize these songs into 3 EPs that were all sort of fit with each other. So one of the EPs is kind of the bluesier stuff. One of the EPs is the more like slow, wintry, songy stuff. And the other one's the more like power pop stuff. And that was all jumbled into one big long record. Now it's 3 EPs, which is called The Music Stands with a period at the end of it. So it's like The Music Stands. And that's the 3 EPs that I'm releasing.
That's fantastic.
After the old Forest Loop.
Yeah, Jonathan, your kids are, how old's your oldest? 9? Is that right?
Oldest is, well, he will be 9.
He will be 9? Okay. My daughter's 16. And I mean, her music, if you could call her a product of today's, I mean, her music taste is varied. I mean, it's YouTube based. I mean, she loves Halo. She listens to the Halo soundtrack.
Interesting.
She loves some old nerdy stuff I put on her radar.
Dig it.
And then she's just, I mean, it is all over the place. So, I mean, probably a good thing of our modern culture, people are actually more open to a broader spectrum of sounds.
Yeah.
Than in a long time.
Man, I just always subscribe to the old Duke Ellington adage that, there are only 2 kinds of music, really, good music and bad music. And to that I add that, like, often I like bad music, too. There should be room for all of it.
Yeah.
Speaking of rooms, we're in the Crosstown.
Oh, yeah, you guys are in my residency.
You are the initial, what would you call
inaugural?
Inaugural?
Am I the inaugural music resident of Crosstown Art Space?
You could say Artist Zero?
Artist Zero.
Is that, well, I mean.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's probably hard to describe the room we're in, but it's like a glorified project studio / rehearsal space that's also got like some cool vintage lamps and chairs and couch in it.
So can we talk about the program, the residency?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Crosstown Arts is a nonprofit. I'm not really sure how to describe what it is they do, but they, host art events and have a lot of like art for initiatives that they execute. I don't really know. Actually, it's really dumb of me that I don't really know how to describe who they are or what they do. But one thing they were really the driving force behind the renovation and the reinvigoration of this Sears Crosstown building, which has become the Crosstown Concourse.
Yes.
They were the driving force. One of the co-founders of Crosstown Arts was one of the main architects, and they're just amazingly forward-thinking people who created this like city within a city. It's like a utopian microcosm inside of these walls. And for those who don't know, they should just look up the Crosstown Concourse website to see pictures. It's a massive, multi-million square footage, like giant brick building that used to be like one of the Sears main distribution centers in the southeastern United States. And this building is one of the like most massive buildings in America, I believe, in terms of square footage.
Right.
But Crosstown Arts is hosting, now that this building is open, one of the things they did was they were hosting artist residencies for visual artists or artists of all mediums. And I caught wind of that in 2016. That's when this building was still like under major renovation, like it was gutted. But I emailed Crosstown Arts and I was like, are you going to do music residencies? And they replied that they had been thinking about it, but they weren't really sure what that was going to look like. And they knew who I was. And so they were like, do you want to go have lunch and talk about this? And I sort of wound up consulting, doing like consultation about what it would be. And I kind of built this, or advised, that my ideal music residency space would be not unlike the rooms I've grown up in, which would be just a room that had, a computer that had Pro Tools and Logic. And I mean, the iMac over there has, Ableton, Logic, Pro Tools, which is what I'm most familiar with.
Yeah.
And it's got Premiere Pro and Photoshop, the full Adobe suite.
Adobe Suite. Mm.
And there's some nice monitors over there. There's a little PA system in here, a drum set, a bass amp, a guitar amp. I mean, they backlined this whole room so that basically a musician could come in and create. And, I'm not sure, honestly, how many musicians or multi-instrumentalists, people who are very recording savvy of their own, that the space would be beneficial for. But certainly all of those things are available. And it's like what I've wound up doing, strangely enough, more than sort of the thing I've always done, which is record myself playing all the instruments on my songs. But I've actually wound up hosting all the bands I play in, rehearsing, and I've kind of got it set up to where people could just come in and it's ready to roll, and they don't really feel like red lights going, clock's not ticking like it would be in a studio, and I'm getting really great sounds in here. And that's been the big revelation for me, is that I sort of have realized that I really sort of enjoy playing the role of recording engineer and producer myself. And the other big thing is, there was a huge revelation for me, is that like going somewhere else, leaving my abode,
right?
Not just going into my room where I could shut the door or do it, but like leaving, driving or riding my bike, or sometimes I skate here, like whatever, like coming to this room and feeling the palpable huge amounts of energy that are like in the main central atrium out there. And then coming back here.
The ice cream.
Oh, the ice cream too. But like, it's just so important to like go do it somewhere else,
Why is that? Because I have a home room and I work out of there, but have you thought, what is the psychological reason why?
It's the idea of going to work or something, right?
I forget, but I did read like a study on thresholds. There's something that changes, like your brain, like patterns are altered just in different ways. And I don't know, that's about all I can remember about that.
But you like it. I mean, it's working for you.
Well, it's incredible.
Yeah.
To feel, it just gives you more of a sense of maybe purpose.
Oh,
perhaps.
that's wonderful.
It's not as easy to just go, well, I'm just going to go watch TV now or whatever.
I can get a lot done binge watching Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, exactly. But this residency program is amazing. They have people from all over the world doing shorter. I have a long residency because I've been fine tuning this room for them, and but I've met people from all over the world, like of different artistic walks.
Yeah, how many disciplines are represented here? We've got
There's sculpting, painting, dancing, music.
wood shop.
There's a wood shop, state-of-the-art wood shop.
Yes.
There's going to be a shared art space that you can sort of subscribe to.
That's fantastic.
It's an incredible place here.
Yeah.
It really is. And they're hosting, there's also a theater being built here that's like state-of-the-art, that they'll have concerts. And
Oh, good.
Very cool.
it's far out.
And you're hosting your EP concert here as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, again, not that anybody probably will hear this before then, but I'm going to do this weird experimental jam session for my EP release.
Yes.
Which is going to be contingent upon hopefully musicians and dancers and rappers and loop station people, A, showing up, and B, being empathetic with each other because, a friend of mine, I've made a really good connection and friendship with a person who had one of the first artist residencies that was my direct neighbor here is a brilliant thinker and artist named S.O. Tolson, who now works for Crosstown Arts. But we're going to kind of co-host my EP release, and he hosts these shows called the Artistic Lounge, and he has a band called the Artistic Duo. It's a duo, but they're like a cappella looping band.
Oh, cool.
And he and I have talked about one thing we want to do here at the concourse in the future is maybe do a monthly open jam session for improvisers where we sort of maybe do a 10-minute opening loop improv together, and where we could illustrate a few things. One, it's okay to fall on your face and make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Two, it's more important to listen to the other person than it is to think about what you're doing, because oftentimes people get in a situation like that and they just start doing their thing. You know? I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. It happens. I mean, the other thing is we're human. We're all going to do that sometimes. But to kind of hopefully set your mind frame up at the beginning to be more empathetic. Anyway, we would hopefully do all that subconsciously in a live improv at the beginning of these jam sessions, and then we're going to do a play-by-play afterwards where we kind of analyze what we did.
A post-mortem?
Yes, where we sort of talk about, why did we make the decisions we made?
Oh, that's great.
Subconsciously, or whatever. That actually reminds me, another thing I've been doing in this room is interviewing other people. I've become the interviewee.
Yes.
When normally I have people sitting right where I'm sitting on this couch, and I've been interviewing, I interviewed Eric Gales and Luther Dickinson.
We'll have to put a link to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kenny Crossway,
Yeah.
Art Emiston, and Mark Franklin. I'm about to interview a whole host of other people.
Fantastic.
But I've also have a podcast. It'll probably be a podcast in the long form, and I've been videoing them as well. And there's going to be a more truncated video component to each episode. But we've all been collaborating on a musical piece that's growing overdub-wise, vertically, and horizontally. It's growing an exquisite corpse of music, because I'll let the people who go that way only hear a few seconds of the end of one piece, and then it goes forward. So if you're familiar with the drawing, exquisite corpse, where you draw something on a piece of paper, but you can only see the lines of the folded part, and you could draw whatever you want. It occurred to me you could do a musical version of that by only letting them hear the very tail end of something. You know?
Wow.
So
when's that available?
Well, what I think is going to happen is, because I'm really just creating so much content in this room now, and my time's running out here, but it may be best to leave editing and polishing and finishing a lot of those projects for when I'm done here. Because it's stuff I can do on my own Pro Tools rig at home when I'm having the huge crash about being sad that my residency is over. I'll still at least have a lot of work to do, like finishing it. You know?
While you're binge watching,
we need to make a trio record.
While
here.
you're binge watching
should.
Sherlock Holmes,
Right.
you can edit.
Right.
Yes.
Searching for purpose.
But speaking of, we should all do some trio recording here. While
I am not opposed to that at all. That would be awesome.
Carl,
I'm here.
you and I did a
Yes.
recording here with the brilliant pianist and vocalist Catherine Hedlund.
Oh, Hedlund, yeah, she's great.
Everything she does is like it doesn't look like it's that hard to her at all. Yeah, she's fabulous.
Anything
Singing
further?
Singing in tune is not hard for her, nor playing well is not hard for her.
How much more can I talk about myself?
It's been good. It's been a good run, man.
I'm really not this
Have we asked?
self-concerned.
Well, it's just good to reflect. I mean, I think you got some good things to say too. I always like the the mentorship aspect of like the pedagogy of like, hey, I would love for up and coming people to kind of be like, oh, a little headspace,
Well,
adjustment.
and that does kind of bring up a point that, you asked me to plug some musicians who are great on the scene right now, but if there's anybody that we should be seeking out, it's the older ones. Ed Finney,
Yeah.
brilliant jazz guitarist. Make a point to go see him at every opportunity that you can.
Yes.
He
Right.
changed my life when I was 16 years old at the Babylon Cafe. I stumbled across this old psychedelic hippie-looking dude who was playing bebop guitar solos without any accompaniment and harmonizing them with his voice.
Oh, wow.
And I might have been under the influence as a teenager of some things, but it changed my life all the way around. And these days I get to call him a friend and make music with
Yeah.
him, and I just think of people like that. Howard Grimes, anytime you see that he's playing drums, like, you should go see him play drums.
Who's he hitting with lately?
Well, Bo Keys,
Okay.
when they play, I know
Right.
that he's often the drummer. Charles Hodges, those guys who are still with us. Leroy Hodges, Flick, the brilliant bass. I mean, those are the guys that played on.
You mentioned Sam Shoup plays out.
Well, Sam Shoup, of course. I mean, this guy, he's one of the professors of jazz now.
Yeah.
At U of M, and I can't say enough about what a brilliant mind he is, and he exemplifies being a musical thinker over being a technical musician player. As a matter of fact, I'm ashamed. I have a hard time. I don't know if Sam will ever hear this. I almost cry saying this, but like, I have a hard time making music with Sam because I'm so nervous to play around him because I know that he can hear everything so well that it just makes, there are very few, really, I don't have a hard time playing with just about anybody. He's one of those people that I freeze up every time we make music together. I second guess everything I do because I just know he can hear it,
Right.
But he's a very giving person. He did a lot in allowing me that instrument to learn on when I was a teenager. And, I'm sure he's going to be cranking out future jazz musicians the right way, telling them what to listen to that's right. And, not that I would know, because I really am pretty much a self-taught musician in a lot of senses, having had teachers and having gotten to play a lot of gigs with some of the professors and teachers and stuff. But I would say I didn't go through the program, So I don't.
Well, a lot of guys haven't. Yeah, a lot of guys haven't.
That way at all.
Yeah. Come on, Jonathan. I know
That
you got
was great,
something
man.
else. Oh, are we rapping? Is this a rap?
Are you putting me on the spot?
Oh, are we rapping it?
I'll give you guys one more question, man.
We have one more. Oh, shit. Got the EP.
Do y'all have a list? How do you do this?
I mean, I knew, since we're going, I'll edit this, but I knew, the background, just, to me, you kind of exemplify a born and raised, Memphis musician. Memphis has been through ups and downs, and everyone, even in the articles I read, everyone's hopeful for a resurgence. I heard the glory days were 90s, up until 9/11. Up until when Jeff Buckley drowned, I mean, there was like a golden era happening with.
See, that's so weird. I don't see anything like that.
I don't know. Well, as far as like
my perspective is that the '90s were a vapidly horrible time for music in general.
What about '80s?
I think the '80s are aging way better than the '90s.
As far as like
grunge rock and all that stuff was bad. And really, my early 20s were in the 90s, and I was like, what should have been my musical prime was robbed by this just black hole of weird music making. Like, I don't know, like the whole rock and roll thing, and just, or I don't mean that rock and roll's bad. Like, rock and roll is here to stay forever. But I think of rock and roll, I think of Chuck Berry and, you know, the Rolling Stones, not like
Nirvana.
Well, but I like some Nirvana too, so don't get me wrong. But I mean, you know, just the whole flannel shirt. Stylistically, if you look at what was like the styles of the 90s, like it was just kind of for lack of a better word. And I feel like it was a bleak time for me personally as a musician. One of the best things that happened, though, is that I decided at some point that I wanted to really concentrate on studying jazz drumming.
Right.
And I kind of really like quit gigging as a bass player, and just stopped. I sold my bass amp. You know, I sold my Fodera.
Oh.
And I just started playing jazz drums, man. Speaking of Foderas, I want to get a Fodera guitar now. Have you seen that? That, like, they're making the most hot guitar.
Like arch top, like solid body, or arch
No,
top?
like electric.
Oh, I bet it's gonna
solid
kill.
body, like
the Tom Anderson sewer kind of vibe.
kind of. But
Okay.
they look like Foderas.
One last thing, I know as far as, so we mentioned some names, Eric Gales. You know, why not? Yeah, I'm embarrassed. I blanked on his name, but progressive fusion guitarist who passed away.
Oh, Sean Lane.
Thank you.
I did play with him a lot. That's true.
How many for Sean Lane fans? And there's, you know, because of YouTube, more people keep
But
discovering.
see, you know,
his-
you look at
know.
Sean. I mean, again, and those are associations that if people look at me in that light, then I'm just going to seem like this player. But
No,
musician-
but we've already
These-
established.
You know, again, though. Well, I'm not saying that about this blog, but this is like things I've had to sort of fight my whole life,
no,
because I want to have my cake and eat it too. I love all of it, and to me, I just want to make.
But that's
any
Memphis
kind of
too. It's a
music, and
Memphis thing, right?
That ultimately is a Memphis thing.
Yeah.
Sean was way more into like art and film and literature than trying to be a badass guitar player. He just was wired in such a way that, and his hand was built in such a way that, like, what came out of him was a thing that's kind of irreplicable by mere mortals. And he was like, I can't even think about what I'm doing really. And he was like, if it's hard for me, I won't do it. He looked at a lot of this like mind-bending, super complicated, fast things that's just broken up into small, simple components, sort of strung together, which I think is a great way to look at just about anything. But I mean, what was your question about him? I don't know.
Well, just I mean, for people who are like you've already just said, like people who are Sean Lane fans and maybe would associate, like you just brought around, like, hey, arts, literature. He was a dude. He was a Memphian. You happen to hit with him.
Yeah, I mean, he was a savant, and it's interesting, man. I mean, I think about what I learned, you know, the music that he turned me on to that was the best, besides the fact that he had like VHS copy of that 76 Weather Report live at Montreux Jazz Fest. Like, we're talking in the 90s when we played with him. So before anybody, it would be years. He had such a huge collection of stuff like that.
Wow.
So that blew my mind. But like the Malagasy guitarist DeGary, like I learned about that guy from Sean, or like Srinivas, the electric mandolin Carnatic Indian classical musician.
Wow.
Carnatic. You know, those are the things I learned from Sean.
Mm-hmm.
Or like Mike Lee films. You know, I don't know, just like I don't think he ever showed me a guitar lick.
That's great. I mean,
And man,
great.
it was so crazy, you know, to play like bass with him, and again, you know, man, I will say, if I could just go back and do it now, nowadays when I play music, I feel relaxed and confident in myself, you know, and that's one of the beautiful things I think we all hope we can get to, which is this,
Right.
like, well, I know what I know how I'm going to play. I'm just going to trust that the moment's going to carry me there, and that my studies will bring me to this moment in time where I can leave them all behind and make this music with other people. But
Right.
at the time, in my early 20s, it was like I was frozen. My hands were getting tight, I mean, I'll never forget playing the Atlanta Institute of Music, like a guitar clinic with him as a bassist. And it was Jeff Sipe was the drummer, Apartment Q258, and it was the first time that they'd ever played some of this music together. They'd played together before because Sean had sat in with the Aquarium Rescue Unit, which was the band that Jimmy Herring came from.
That's an incredible band.
Bruce Hampton.
Man.
Which was a band that I used to, love going to see here in Memphis when they came through. But I was so nervous. There are YouTube videos of it, and you can watch. I just standing so still and so scared. And the bass playing is so stiff. And if I could have just taken some breaths and relaxed and known that it was going to be okay, I could have probably played a lot better, because I did have the know-how, but I didn't have the confidence, I think that kind of sense of assertion, not domineering in a jock athletic way. Again, I think that's like a huge danger of choppy practice and playing, but just exude a comfortableness.
All right, that right there is a big confirmation, if you don't mind me to confirm. Let me confirm that. In St. Louis, I got to study with Tom Kennedy a little bit. Who's Dave Weckl. Yeah, Tom's.
Speaking of Foderas,
he's been a virtuoso his entire life. Him and his brother Ray were just phenoms as used, and then the whole Dave Weckl, Jay Oliver, the whole thing. But I remember my first lesson with him. I said, "So, what is it about these great bass players?" We were talking, because he had played with Steps Ahead, Patitucci, and just running off a list of upright guys. He says, what? Honestly, he says, there's a state of mind that all these guys have. You can talk about a confidence, but there's a state of mind to where they're just like. That's what he was trying to describe. I think they're able to relax, and they've done all the work, they've studied, but there's a state of mind that enables them to be present with all their faculties and without any, like you said, minus tension, minus anxiety.
Yeah.
Well, and something we touched on earlier at the beginning, I guess it was, to understand your role in the ensemble.
Oh, goodness.
Your instrument's role, no matter what instrument that is.
Well, it's funny, maybe this is a good place to close, but coming full circle to this, like I was just saying, I didn't play bass for a long time. And as a matter of fact, I had a chip on because having grown up a multi-instrumentalist songwriter and then accidentally becoming a bass player and getting a lot of accolades locally as a bass player, I felt pigeonholed that was all I was ever going to be if I didn't make a choice to sort of drop that persona. And to that degree, I kind of hated the bass for a long time, and I shunned it and didn't want to have anything to do with it. But these days I've been playing gigs on bass again and doing sessions, and I even bought a bass amp again, and I have to say I love it more than ever. And because of all my time off for unhardwiring from all the kind of BS like chop building stuff that I was trying to do as a teenager, it's not that I don't still, surprisingly enough, I probably have more facility now, but because of the time off and because of being a more well-rounded musician as a drummer and a songwriter and a guitar player, which are things I was before I was ever a bass player anyway, my understanding of my role and my mindset of relaxedness as a bass player, that place, it's like stronger than it ever was when I was just trying to be a bass player.
That's wonderful. And I want to co-opt that word, relaxedness.
Relaxedness.
That is an awesome.
I think it's time for us all to do some relaxing, man. My throat's getting sore, dude.
Paul,
thank you, man.
Thank you, man. We're going to post your links. We're going to post your blog, all your stuff. Highly recommend you all check Paul out.
Man, thanks for talking to me.
Go see him in person. Go see some human beings make some music.
For sure.
Hope you enjoyed this time with Paul Taylor. Jonathan and I have played with Paul. It was delightful. The interview was delightful. Interesting note, the interview was recorded at
Crosstown Arts.
Crosstown Arts. Paul has an internship there. Crosstown Arts has several internships for artists of different mediums. I've seen the sculptors and wood makers and beat makers, and Paul has been the curator of the music studio during this interview, and it was a great Great facility. Hats off.
Doing a lot of great work.
Kudos to Crosstown for supporting artists in Memphis. Special thanks to our sponsors again, Snakebite Company, Redwire Audiovisual, and
Ernestine and Hazel.
Ernestine and Hazel's. Get yourself a
Soul Burger.